do work with Ensemble. I do work with Ensemble Therapy. I'm the parent coach and coordinator. I also have another business where I complete psychological evaluations. I'm a licensed specialist in school psychology. And so currently I work in the private school setting and as well as some public schools and some districts. And I am a former teacher. I taught elementary pretty much all over from K all the way to 5th grade. And then I'm also a parent. So that kind of informs my practice in that I can give you best practice and research-based and then a little bit of real life. All right, so today we are going to cover a lot. We're going to be talking about how to recognize the cognitive, emotional, and social developmental needs and challenges for your teens. We're going to be talking about how to implement developmentally appropriate practice to connect with your child, validate their experience, and hopefully improve that communication. And establishing clear expectations for screens and social media. That's a huge piece for our teens, especially post-COVID. We've seen a huge kind of shift in that, like a big bump. Just a lot more time on screens and a lot more isolation socially. And so we'll get more into that later. Obviously excited about that. And then also how to identify characteristics for when it's important to seek help from professionals, at what point in time that occurs. All right. Oops, sorry, I went backwards. Going forwards. Okay, so first I'm going to share this short video. Her name is Sarah Jane Blakemore. She is a cognitive neuroscientist, and she's going to be talking a little bit about how the adolescent brain and particularly their prefrontal cortex, how it informs our typical teenage behavior. All right. I'm going to start it and then double check that the sound's working and then click to the right spot. It's working, we're good.
Defined as the period of life that starts with the biological, hormonal, physical changes of puberty and ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. It can go on a long time. One of the brain regions that changes most dramatically during adolescence is called prefrontal cortex. So this is a model of the human brain, and this is prefrontal cortex right at the front. Prefrontal cortex is an interesting brain area. It's proportionally much bigger in humans than in any other species, and it's involved in a whole range of high-level cognitive functions, things like decision-making, planning what you're going to do tomorrow or next week or next year. Inhibiting inappropriate behavior, so stopping yourself saying something really rude or doing something really stupid. It's also involved in social interaction, understanding other people, and self-awareness. So MRI studies looking at the development of this region have shown that it really undergoes dramatic development during the period of adolescence. So if you look at grey matter volume, for example, grey matter volume across age from age 4 to 22 years increases during childhood, which is what you can see on this graph. It peaks in early adolescence. The arrows indicate peak grey matter volume in prefrontal cortex. You can see that that peak happens a couple of years later in boys relative to girls, and that's probably because boys go through puberty a couple of years later than girls on average. And then during adolescence, there's a significant decline in grey matter volume in prefrontal cortex. Now that might sound bad, but actually this is a really important developmental process because grey matter contains cell bodies and connections between cells, the synapses. And this decline in grey matter volume during prefrontal cortex is thought to correspond to synaptic pruning, the elimination of unwanted synapses. This is a really important process. It's partly dependent on the environment that the animal or the human is in that synapses that are being used are strengthened and synapses that aren't being used in that particular environment are pruned away. You can think of it a bit like pruning a rose bush. You prune away the weaker branches so that the remaining important branches can grow stronger. And this process, which effectively fine-tunes brain tissue according to the species-specific environment, is happening in prefrontal cortex and in other brain regions during the period of human adolescence. So a second line of inquiry that we use to track changes in the adolescent brain is using functional MRI to look at changes in brain activity across age. So I'll just give you an example from my lab. So in my lab, we're interested in the social brain. That is, the network of brain regions that we use to understand other people and to interact with other people. So I like to show a photograph of a soccer game to illustrate two aspects of how your social brains work. So this is a soccer game. Michael Owen has just missed a goal and he's lying on the ground. And the first aspect of the social brain that this picture really nicely illustrates is how automatic and instinctive social emotional responses are. So within a split second of Michael Owen missing this goal, everyone is doing the same thing with their arms and the same thing with their face. Even Michael Owen, as he slides along the grass, is doing the same thing with his arms and presumably has a similar facial expression. And the only people who don't are the guys in yellow at the back. And I think they're on the wrong end of the stadium, and they're doing another social emotional response that we all instantly recognize. And that's the second aspect of the social brain that this picture really nicely illustrates, how good we are at reading other people's behavior, their actions, their gestures, their facial expressions, in terms of their underlying emotions and mental states. So you don't have to ask any of these guys, you have a pretty good idea of what they're feeling and thinking at this precise moment in time. So that's what we're interested in looking at in my lab. So in my lab, we bring adolescents and adults into the lab to have a brain scan. We give them some kind of task that involves thinking about other people, their minds, their mental states, their emotions. And one of the findings that we've found several times now, as have other labs around the world, is part of the prefrontal cortex, called medial prefrontal cortex, which is shown in blue on the slide. And it's right in the middle of prefrontal cortex, in the midline of your head. This region is more active in adolescents when they make these social decisions and think about other people than it is in adults. And this is actually a meta-analysis of 9 different studies in this area from labs around the world, and they all show the same thing, that activity in this medial prefrontal cortex area decreases during the period of adolescence. And we think that might be because adolescents and adults use a different mental approach, a different cognitive strategy to make social decisions. And one way of looking at that is to do behavioural studies, whereby we bring people into the lab and we give them some kind of behavioural task. And I'll just give you another example of the kind of task that we use in my lab. So imagine that you're the participant in one of our experiments. You come to the lab, you see this computerised task. In this task, you see a set of shelves. Now, there are objects on these shelves, on some of them, and you'll notice there's a guy standing behind the set of shelves, and there are some objects that he can't see. They're occluded from his point of view with a kind of grey piece of wood. This is the same set of shelves from his point of view. Notice that there are only some objects that he can see, whereas there are many more objects that you can see. Now, your task is to move objects around. The director, standing behind the set of shelves, is going to direct you to move objects around. But remember, he's not going to ask you to move objects that he can't see. This introduces a really interesting condition whereby there's a kind of conflict between your perspective and the director's perspective. So imagine he tells you to move the top truck left. There are 3 trucks there. You're going to instinctively go for the white truck because that's the top truck from your perspective. But then you have to remember, oh, he can't see that truck, so he must mean me to move the blue truck, which is the top truck from his perspective. Now, believe it or not, normal, healthy, intelligent adults like you make errors about 50% of the time on that kind of trial. They move the white truck instead of the blue truck. So we give this kind of task to adolescents and adults, and we also have a control condition where there's no director, and instead we give people a rule. We tell them, okay, we're going to do exactly the same thing, but this time there's no director. Instead, you've got to ignore objects with a dark grey background. You'll see that this is exactly the same condition, only in the no director condition, they just have to remember to apply this somewhat arbitrary rule, whereas in the director condition, they have to remember to take into account the director's perspective in order to guide their ongoing behaviour. Okay, so if I just show you the percentage errors in a large developmental study we did, this is in a study ranging from age 7 to adulthood, and what you're going to see is the percentage errors in the adult group in both conditions. So the grey is the director condition, and you see that our intelligent adults are making errors about 50% of the time, whereas they make far fewer errors when there's no director present, when they just have to remember that rule of ignoring the grey background. Developmentally, these two conditions develop in exactly the same way between late childhood and mid-adolescence. There's an improvement, in other words, a reduction of errors in both of these trials, in both of these conditions. But it's when you compare the last two groups, the mid-adolescent group and the adult group, where things get really interesting, because there is no continued improvement in the no direct condition. In other words, everything you need to do in order to remember the rule and apply it seems to be fully developed by mid-adolescence. Whereas in contrast, if you look at the last two grey bars, there's still a significant improvement in the directed condition between mid-adolescence and adulthood. And what this means is that the ability to take into account someone else's perspective in order to guide ongoing behaviour, which is something, by the way, that we do in everyday life all the time, is still developing in mid to late adolescence. So if you have a teenage son or a daughter and you sometimes think they have problems taking other people's perspectives, you're right, they do, and this is why. So
I'm going to stop it there. And so what she's trying to say, and says a lot better than I can say, is that, I'm going to stop the sound sharing on my computer, is that basically the teenage brain is different. And you guys already know this because you see it in action every single day, but in that it is forming and it is growing and changing, but that ability to take perspective for them is different than it is for adults. And so we see that when we talk about, and it is cool because you see that as you learn and talk about them as they go through these developmental milestones. And keep in mind that these developmental milestones, I kind of framed it just like when they were younger. You know, we have the physical, the emotional, and the social. And so the first part we're going to look at is the 13 through 15-year-olds. And so this age range, we see a lot of challenge of authority. I'm sure you guys, anyone that has a teen or works with teens knows this. There's loneliness, there's wide mood swings. They'll often reject things of childhood, like that favorite lovey they had. They'll reject it all of a sudden, or something that they used to do, they'll say, oh, that's babyish. They'll be argumentative, disobedient. There's a lot of identity development going on. Am I normal? A lot of daydreaming. They'll have a lot of vocational goals that will change frequently. In a really cool way, they begin to develop their own value system that's separate than their parents. There's a big desire for privacy at this age, magnifying of their own problems, like no one understands this problem. Socially, they're a lot more reliant on peer relations and less dependent on parents. And this actually occurs around age 10. That's where we start to see that shift from reliance on what their parents are saying to looking outward at their peers. So if you have a 10-year-old, it's happening. Their peer influence in this age range is incredibly strong. Everything from the way they dress to their interests to their behavior. You might be having some challenging conversations about morals, privileges, especially as they realize that adults aren't perfect. They're also prone to odd bouts of childish behavior, particularly if they're under stress, like playing with toys that they maybe haven't played with since they were much younger, or acting in a way that acts much younger. They're developing a stronger sense of their identity. Their focus on themselves definitely increases during this time. They need a lot of recognition, positive feedback to help maintain that self-esteem and self-confidence, because their problems are getting bigger, more complex. And so they need that extra parental support in those areas. You'll also notice improvement in motor skills. They have little difficulty tackling even like the trickiest physical tasks. They're better at communicating their thoughts and feelings, and they have really strong values and ideals. They're better at problem solving and applying their decision-making skills to more social and academic situations, and they'll be strongly affected when they have worries or concerns. This is also the age where they take more risks, especially if there's a negative peer influence. For some parents, they feel like their child is pulling away from them at this time, but it's really important for you to be incredibly encouraging. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit. Non-judgmental, value their views, concerns, and just always letting them know that you're there for them. The next group, the 15 through 18-year-olds, also, you're going to see a lot of that desire for autonomy. There'll be a lot of strong peer group allegiances. They're going to do what their friends are doing even more intensely. You'll see them engage in like fad behaviors like TikTok dances and whatnot. A lot of identity development is occurring at this age. There's also experimentation. You might have noticed that they're experimenting with gender, drugs, alcohol, friends, job taking. You might notice more risk-taking behavior, just like Dr. Blakemore was referring to. And this independence can lead to conflict, especially within the family. This is where a lot of those fights and arguments occur, because it's a difficult line as a parent to walk, where you're trying to be supportive, but then your child feels like you're being too controlling. There's definitely a mismatch between the way they see themselves and then your perception of who they should be. They might show a greater interest in family and cultural traditions. It's a really cool time to explore that. They'll recognize the role they play. They'll have a greater concern about others. You'll definitely find that a lot of their questions and thoughts revolve around issues that their friends have. It's pretty much a bulk of the counseling sessions that go on with teens is hearing about their friends, and then also their parents. They have an improved planning skills, more foresight, deeper understanding of potential consequences, and vital life skills for independence. All these things are really becoming developed during this age. You might notice them being a little bit self-centered, despite that developing moral sense, which is kind of a conundrum, but they'll definitely still consider their own viewpoint to be right, even though they understand that others have their own views. And they might not admit it, but they definitely look to adults and look to their parents as those kind of moral compasses. And you can still provide that really safe space and supportive space for them, because becoming an adult can be really overwhelming sometimes. And so being that parent support is important. So one of the questions that comes up after looking at those developmental benchmarks is if you notice that your child's deviating from that, or your adolescent is deviating from that. And so especially in this time where anxiety and depression, we're seeing more and more cases of those, both, across the United States are being reported, but also in our own area. So the things to kind of consider before reaching out is, first identifying what concerns you have, like which behaviors are most concerning. Then how long have those behaviors been present? Really sitting down and thinking about it. Maybe even looking back at a calendar, like, oh, okay, so we've noticed that these things have been going on since January or since November. Are the behaviors impacting their daily functioning? Are they unable to get out of their bed? Is it that they can't complete homework because they can't focus on it? And then check with your pediatrician, use them as a counterpoint to try to check in with. I know that those well-check visits or check-ins with the pediatrician can be quick, but oftentimes if you email them in advance or message them through your portal and let them know that you'd like to have a longer discussion about X, Y, or Z, just kind of setting it up for them, then they'll be more prepared to have a longer discussion with you. The other thing is screen the therapist for sure, both as someone who does psychological assessments and also who does counseling work. It's really important, and so very rarely does it occur that parents have a conversation and try to understand who you are and what your kind of idea, like what your framework is and how you are going to be working with their child and what you're specifically going to be doing. And so it's important as a parent to ask those questions. I almost like to think of it like a first date kind of. You're kind of sussing them out. Are they going to vibe with your kid? Is it going to work out? And so really, if you don't get a good vibe from that person, or you don't think your kid's going to get along with them, call somebody else and set up those phone calls or, virtual face-to-faces. It's okay to ask for those things. The other thing is to check with your insurance policy. A lot of people are private pay. Check and see what your insurance company will cover prior to reaching out, so you're more informed when you're having those discussions about pricing. Clinically, when we're assessing, we're going to be looking at intensity, duration, and frequency, and trying to determine if things are rising to that clinical level or bar. All right. So when you're communicating with your teen, we kind of covered this a little bit, but I'm going to go more in depth right now. Really, all they are looking for is that connection, the validation, and the communication. And it doesn't always seem like that, but they are, and that's what they're saying, you know, in counseling and when talking to teens that are not my own, they're saying they want those things. My parents never talk to me. They're always looking at their phone. So really work to show them that love, show that positive attention. It's really a must. And spending time with them, explicitly saying like, let's go do this. Let's spend time together. Listen to them when they talk. Sometimes that could be admittedly a little bit hard, especially when they're talking about, you know, hyper focusing on a certain friend group or, you know, something that they need to do, but to you might not have as much value, to them does. So really think like that the phone needs to be away. You need to be looking at them, listening to them. Don't assume that they know how much you love them. Tell them that you love them just as much as you did when they were a toddler. Even if they kind of like shrug it off, they really appreciate that. If they don't seem interested in bonding, because that's something that will come up like, well, they don't want to spend any time with me. Just keep trying. On days when you're really having trouble kind of making that connection, just sitting next to them silently, doing your own thing, watching TV, can be the start of a conversation, going on a walk. Keep in mind though, that unconditional love does not mean unconditional approval. And you can still discipline them while showing that you won't withdraw that love based on their behavior. If you're pointing out something that your teen can do better, keep your criticism, and this works for partners too, keep your criticism really specific to the behavior rather than making personal statements about them. They are really good at picking those things out, and you want to avoid power struggles at all costs because that just makes the conversation less productive. Really making sure that you are setting reasonable expectations. They tend to live up or down to their parental expectations, so make sure you're setting them high. Really, instead of focusing on achievements, focus on the fact that you want them to be kind and considerate and respectful and honest. They gain confidence through success. So making sure that you're preparing them for challenges and then supporting them when they have, you know, bitten off more than they can chew, and show them how to recover and what to do next. It's really important to make sure that you are setting that positive example. They really learn to behave by watching their parents, and your actions generally speak louder than your words. So show them how you cope with stress, how you cope with, you know, difficulties within your friend group or relationships by really verbally telling them like, I'm feeling really stressed. I'm going to go for a walk because I know it's a healthy way for me to cope with stress. Or, you know, like I yelled earlier. I shouldn't have yelled. I lost my temper. I'm really stressed. I'm going to go do blank instead. Making sure that you're really a good role model, because more so than ever before, they are watching. So sometimes this will come into play of like, well, they just don't listen to me. I'm just not even going to bother setting rules, because when I do, they just push through them, or they, you know. And discipline isn't about punishing or controlling them. You have to really reframe it in that it's more about teaching. So discuss with them the behavior in a very clear way that's acceptable and unacceptable at school, at home, elsewhere, and create fair, as much as possible, and appropriate consequences for how they behave. So a big thing can be phones. That's often one that'll come up in consults. And so like, they were doing something inappropriate on their phone, or texting inappropriately, or on their phone instead of doing their homework. You know, and so parents will say sometimes like, well, so I just took their phone away. And that can create a lot of frustration, because then the teen's frustrated because their outlet to their world, their friends, their homework, whatever it may be, are all on their phone. And so making sure that you really avoid those ultimatums, and because they're going to interpret that ultimately as some sort of power struggle or a challenge. So be clear and concise. And rather than telling them, like, don't stay out late, set a specific curfew, keep your rules short, keep them to the point, make consequences that are immediate and linked to their choices or actions. Try to make them as natural as possible, just like you did when, and not to link it again, but just like you did when they were a toddler. You explained it, you were clear, you were concise, you didn't talk too much. And you also linked it. Like when a toddler pours out their milk, then they don't have any milk. You just poured that out. Same thing when a teen throws their phone when they're angry and it cracks. Now you have a cracked phone. Obviously changing your tone from your toddler tone to your teen tone, but kind of keeping those same thoughts and frameworks in your brain when you're having those conversations. Teens are also going to be a lot more likely to comply with a rule when they understand its purpose. So there's less to rebel against when they know the limits being imposed for their safety. Be reasonable and avoid setting rules that your teen can't possibly follow. So if you have a chronically messy teen whose room is disgusting, if you just say that they have to have a spotless bedroom, well, they're going to fail at that. So instead focus on, every night I need you to take all the cups out of your room, which is like such a weird thing, but like, why do they have so many cups in their room? I don't know. And so, focusing on that, be flexible. As they demonstrate more responsibility, grant them more freedom. If they show poor judgment, they have more restrictions imposed. The other piece is to really avoid lectures. Teens hate lectures so much. They think they're adults, and when you lecture them, it just doesn't work and they hate it. So really try not to use sarcastic tones. Try to be respectful. Don't use demeaning tones. Don't embarrass them. That is a real piece for teens that they're hypersensitive about as well, is any sort of embarrassment can instill that kind of shame. It puts them immediately in the defensive position, and then it distracts them from whatever you're trying to solve or reflect upon. So before you speak, especially because with teens and parents, sometimes things can get heated really fast because they're really good at knowing exactly where your triggers are because they've lived with you for like 17 years. And so just before you speak, really consider asking yourself, is what you're about to say true? Is it necessary? And is there a way you can say it in a non-judgmental way? And like I said earlier too, this is kind of the same way you should be speaking to your partner as well. So you can kind of consider it to be some of those similar pieces. Really prioritizing your rules will give you and your teen a chance to negotiate and compromise, which they love doing. Making exceptions. That's okay. Like when it comes to homework habits or if they need a mental health day, but consider, before you're negotiating and compromising, how far you're willing to bend, and don't negotiate, obviously, when it comes to restrictions imposed for their safety, like substance abuse, sexual activity, reckless driving. Those are serious ones. And those are ones that you're not going to bend on, and they need to understand that. All right. So screens. This is a huge piece for teens. And so first we're going to talk about some research. So this is from 2018, which I know is pre-COVID. And so this has changed, but the Pew Research Center hasn't put out any research. So I'm going to reference this one, and then we'll talk a little bit about how it's changed. So basically, most teens now, 95% have a smartphone or access to one, which is kind of insane if you think about it, because when I looked at the data from 2011, which was only, just a little bit prior to that, that was not the case. It was around 60%, which 95% of teens having that it's significant. 45%, and this again is pre-pandemic, so I'm going to guess that these numbers are higher now, of teens say that they're online at a near constant basis. To me, you see it, right? Like you see it with teens when you're interacting with teens, how they interact with each other, but it's still kind of an impressive number to think about. There's not really a clear consensus amongst teens about the effect that social media has on their lives. About 40% say that it's had a positive impact because it helps them keep in touch with others. 27% say it's led to more bullying and spreading of rumors. That's something that we've really seen both privately and in the school setting, is that piece is growing, especially during this time when more people, more teens were at home on their computers and less social interaction was happening in person. For some reason, it just spreads even faster online. I think it's the lack of face-to-face. You don't have to say something to their face. You can just spread it, via social media instead. And they said 17% of the respondents feel like the platforms harm relationships and result in less meaningful human interactions. And 84% say that they have access to a game console at home. And 90% say that they play video games of any kind, which is, it's impressive. And it's kind of staggering when you see the actual numbers. So basically, the takeaway is Facebook is no longer the dominant platform amongst teens. We already knew that. And it's clear that the social media environment today revolves less around a single platform than it did 3 years ago, or even 6 years ago. And they feel and they know like they're being left out of something. That's a big piece that comes up when you talk to teens in social media. They feel like they see these people, on Instagram or TikTok that, obviously have coordinated their look and what they're showing and have angled things in a certain way. But these teens and their brains as they're developing are really struggling to grasp and understand that just because that person has that, it's not necessarily a real thing. What I have is real, and keeping that separation at play and that understanding that, a lot of these things are very curated, and, just because you see what these people have does not mean you need to have it, does not mean things are like that, that's just one kind of viewpoint of it. There's, and you probably have seen this with working with teens and also being parents of teens, is that, some people will post, they call them like wealthies, where selfies that display wealth, which obviously, that illustrates things that these kids can't have, or, that aren't attainable. And then it can become a point of frustration or arguments at the home setting too. Especially when we know how much time that they're spending on their screens and really looking into them. So going forward, kind of, looking at their brains online, and considering the technology that they have at their hands. There's a book by, his name is Dr. Mike Brooks, and he wrote it. It's called Tech Happy Life. And so basically a lot of this next part comes from him. So his theory on it, and we see this in kind of collaborating it with that teenage brain, is that there's this allure to screen time, right? Like, the goal is definitely self-regulation and a balanced life, but it's hard because psychologically, when you get a push notification on your phone, or if you can just like click a button or swipe your finger, you gain access to like limitless ways to meet your psychological needs for relatedness or autonomy and competence, like through gaming and sharing pieces like that. And we know that screens they have this grip on us because we're constantly checking our phones. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I have my work email on my phone. So I'm often checking that. I'll get different push notifications that'll come through, and I'll know it's there and I'll check it. Or as I'm working on reports, I have other tabs open. And so it's hard, I'm like, oh, I'm just going to click over here and check on this. And it can almost be addictive in that same way that like gambling and drugs are. And when we understand and look at different studies in the brain, we see that like those same areas light up. That primitive reward system that our brain just loves to have, just like craving junk food. We're really drawn to that seductive promise that technology offers us. And the hard part that many kids and parents and teachers struggle with is that we're living in a world in which we need to use technology. And there's so many wonderful components to it, but it's also a big, the teens and kids, because it's, in elementary schools as well, they really need to regulate themselves and that's really a tough piece. And so it's something that is a constant conversation often with parents, and we also know too, and understanding as more is coming out about how these different companies are acquiring new clients, and how they're kind of manipulating information so that they could, like, withholding likes or only showing certain things on feeds so that they're getting that kind of dopamine release when they're looking at what they're looking at or scrolling through what they're scrolling through. And so it's a really difficult piece to navigate as parents. And also as teachers, when you have to say, put away your phone, or if they're supposed to be working on one thing on their computers and they're actually open, they have a different tab opened. So really the piece that we're looking at too, and this is something that comes up often academically, is that when you're processing information, we still understand, and studies are still indicating, that online reading yields lower comprehension when you're reading from than when you're reading from a printed page. I don't know if that's going to change as their brains change. My prediction is that it will, but current research still indicates that reading paper is that you comprehend it at a faster and better rate. We understand that as people get better at multitasking, they become less creative in their thinking. This is something that's really fascinating because this online time is kind of crowding out the time that might otherwise be spent in prolonged and focused conversation. They're also experiencing chronic distraction. Like when you sit down with a book, you're focused on reading that book, but if you're online or you're reading something online, like a long article, after a couple pages, your brain's going to want to do what it wants to do. And so then you'll start to check your email or go on links or hop from page to page. And so that chronic state of distraction, actually, we understand, follows us long after we shut down our computers, because our brains are plastic. And the more time we spend surfing and skimming and scanning, then the more adept we become at that mode of thinking. And so when you think about this from the teen input and their plastic and developing brains, and how important it is for them to have those states of deep thinking and creativity, and how then that means that you do have to limit some of that screen time. So the other piece to kind of look at that human regression that we're seeing a little bit is that our ancestors had to stay really alert all the time and shift their attention. If there was a caveman who got too wrapped up in their cave painting, they just didn't survive, right? So prolonged and solitary thought is not that natural state. And the internet, you can kind of return us to that natural state of distractedness. But when you compare that with what I was saying earlier, and that kind of chronic distraction, you have to find that balance. And your teens have to find that balance. It's hard to give a concrete, this is how you do this, and this is how you kind of limit this technology, or this is how you change this framework, when we as adults are really struggling with it as well. So the real antidote that we know right now is that real life social connection. It's finding that balance, teaching them how to utilize it when they need to utilize screens for school, for homework, teaching them how to utilize different kind of focus or concentration apps, really explaining how to utilize that. And then focusing on, as much as possible, is that real life social connection, rather than communicating solely with their friends online, encouraging them as much as possible to be with them and have those connections. It's something that you can model as parents and as teachers, and really, like I said earlier, verbally say what you're working on, why you're working on it, and being clear that social connection is something that we are fostering as a family. We're going to sit down at dinner and no one's going to take out their phones. Everyone's phones are going to be charging. At night, we focus on sleep, and so everyone's phones are in a docking station. I have a family media plan that I'm actually going to send to Dana so that she can send it out to anybody that would like access to it. That kind of focuses on that, but because of time, I'm going to zoom past it right now. All right. The next piece that we're going to talk about is suicidal ideation. This is something else that comes up a lot with teens. We see a spike of it in that 13 to 17 age range, actually 13 to 25, but the focus is teens. This is something that has been coming up more and more amongst parents and teens. And first, kind of a disclaimer, talking about suicide and mental health can be scary, and it also can be really uncomfortable. That is one of the biggest things that parents will say is, I just don't feel comfortable talking about that, so I don't want to. And that's the thing, like there's some conversations that just really aren't great to have, and you don't want to have them, but you do need to. So individual risk factors, when we look at those, previous suicide attempts, major illnesses, chronic pain, worldwide pandemics like alcohol abuse, substance abuse, ADHD, any other, there's personality disorders. These things can all impact sleep, getting not enough sleep, too much sleep. All these different pieces can be these risk factors that lead towards suicide, or can make you more prone to having those suicidal ideations. Family history, we've all learned about the ACEs in the past, and so thinking about those things, strife, divorce, change in living situation, change of jobs for parents can impact their emotionality and their feelings. Local clusters of suicide can actually have a contagious influence, which is a scary one to me. Interactions with law enforcement, barriers to accessing healthcare. These are all risk factors that we look at. So when or if you as a teacher or a parent ever have to have these conversations, be really direct. Suicidal inquiries, like I said, can be really uncomfortable. But if any sort of risk factors or warning signs are evident and you notice a large shift or change in their behavior, it's okay to ask. They'll typically, the way that we understand is that anybody that's considering suicide will not generally spontaneously report suicidal ideation, but 70% will communicate their intentions or wishes when asked directly. So ask. How you ask the question really affects the likelihood of getting that truthful response. So make sure you're using a non-judgmental, non-condescending, matter of fact approach. Never ask leading questions like, you're not thinking about it, suicide, are you? I suggest before you have this conversation, if you're going to have this conversation, practice. Seems silly, but it really is such an uncomfortable thing for us as parents, as even as healthcare practitioners. It's really uncomfortable sometimes, and so practice it. Ask it several times. Practice in the mirror what you need to do before talking to them, because the first time is probably going to be harder than you think. So like questions that you might kind of say, or how you might kind of say it is, sometimes people in your situation describe this situation, lose hope. I wonder if you may have lost hope too. Or, are you thinking about being as direct as possible, which is my preference is, are you thinking about hurting or killing yourself? And then trying to ascertain their risk factors. And this is something that counselors are doing, both school counselors are trained in how to do. And so, if you as a parent, if you ask and they say yes, then your next step might be to talk to your school counselor. Or if you have a private counselor you're already seeing, if you feel like you as a parent can't have the rest of the conversation, then connecting as soon as possible with someone that is trained is important. If you feel comfortable going forward, you can say, do you have a plan? That's something that we try to assess is, the intent. Do they have a plan? Do they have access to the things that they need to go forward with their plan? Really assessing that is important. So there's also protective factors that are at play. And if, you've talked to your child or someone that has said that they do want to hurt themselves, then exploring those protective factors with them might be helpful. If they are actively wanting to hurt themselves and they have a plan in place and they have access to the materials necessary to carry through that plan, I highly suggest, you can go to a hospital. If they have a counselor in place or the school counselor, contacting them immediately. If they have said that they do want to hurt themselves, but they don't have a plan or access to those materials, then focusing on those protective factors can be helpful for them. So, talking to them about their cultural or religious beliefs, like I said, the protective factors can be a poor counterbalance if they're high risk, but with moderate or low risk, kind of strengthening those protective factors can be part of the safety planning. That sense of responsibility, life satisfaction, reality testing ability, social support, focusing on those pieces. Okay, so that was kind of an abrupt end, that one, but that's the end of the presentation. I wanted to make sure that I had a little bit of time left for questions. I know I talked really fast, but I also recognize that this is being recorded, so you can watch back certain parts. Does anybody have a question for me? Okay, while people are thinking of their questions then, I have my email address right there. If you're curious about Ensemble therapy at all, or any of the therapists that we have who are trained to work with adolescents, please visit us. Currently, Ensemble therapy, like other places in town, does have a wait list. So if you're even curious about it, I say, like I was talking about earlier, really vetting people, call and talk to people to get an idea, and then get on those wait lists.
Here's a question, Kate.
Yeah,
It's how do we take TikTok away if they have it?
I mean, and that's one of those things that's hard, right? Because just taking it away, that kind of black and white component, they're not going to respond really well to. But talking to them about it, like, what are your concerns about it? Why don't you, as a parent or, as a support person for this teen, like them using it all the time? And then also talk to them about potentially limiting their time, because a lot of teens and adolescents right now are just spending like hours and hours on it. And then also the challenges that are occurring, taking it away, like I said, though, like just completely limiting it in that manner has not been really successful, because they're going to find other ways to get on it or access it or hear about it. And then they're going to feel like everyone's talking about this and I didn't even know what they were talking about. So I would just say, like, really working on having those frank and open conversations with them, also engaging with them on the platform, like sitting next to them and showing basically that you're interested and you care about it. Like, show me about this. What are you doing? And then when that conversation is open, then when there's those challenges or things that you don't feel comfortable with come up, then you can address them. Does that answer that question?
And I always ask why, like, why are you on TikTok? What is it that's interesting so much to you on this? And then as situations come up in the school district or in our neighborhood, I'll share that with them. And this is how TikTok can be dangerous. Like, these are some of the things that you need to stay away from. Because if you're on those neighborhood pages, you'll find several things that happen that have stemmed from TikTok. So having those open conversations about it is a great way to go.
Yeah.
That was a really good question. Do you guys have any more questions? And I guess that would be the same with any social media platform, because they show up and we can't even keep track of new apps.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's hard to limit it, or just say, like, trying to put safety pieces on their phone or this and that, because they're smart, like, and they also have more time than you as a parent or even an adult ever will to invest in getting around your parental blocks, or like creating a fake account, or using your friend's phone for this or that. Like, it's hard to just block things in those ways, because they're smart, they'll find a way. I'm looking through the chat to make sure. And like I said, I'll send you, Dana, the media plan to use as a conversation point with your kids, with your teens.
That's great. So even just an hour of TikTok has changed how my daughter views her body. That is very true. So this media plan could help. If you send, I have my information in the chat. If you send me an email, I will send you that media plan. And a copy of this recording if you need that as well. It'll probably take several hours to download, so it might be in the morning before I can send those things out. But if you send me an email, I will keep track of it and send that back to you. I also put a quick survey in the chat box. If you guys can take that as well, I'm putting it there again. It basically just asks for your email so that I can invite you to other seminars and webinars that we have, and to see what other times or what other subjects you guys could be interested in. Basically, we're here for you guys. So whatever you need assistance in, we'll be happy to try to provide it. I've got a direct message about ADHD. We do offer testing through the schools. And Kate, do you guys do that testing at Ensemble Therapy?
So so there is some of that, but I typically suggest that parents start with their pediatrician, because that's where your child's kind of medical health professional. And then if they recommend an evaluation, we're talking to your school counselor, assistant principal, because as public school students, you are eligible for that evaluation through the Free and Public Education Act. And it's something that is, could be supportive, and especially if the teachers are seeing difficulties in school. If it's solely in the home setting, then you might consider going private, but if it's impacting them through school, then having that discussion on campus is also beneficial. I'm reading more of the chats too, so I'm not a teen, so I'm not able to read and talk at the same time, because they're also good at that. They're like scrolling and talking at the same time.
Hey, can you hear me? Hey, maybe this is not the common problem, but what if your teen is too clingy, like a 14-year-old son that's just like, like you're trying to be like, go explore the world, do things without me, and they keep wanting to be near you?
So maybe this was the case pre quarantine. I've noticed that that's been something that's picked up, is a lot more clinginess with parents, just because there's more fear-based kind of things like out there for them. Like, they are worried about things, their anxiety is higher, not to a clinical level, but so like you're their safe person, and so they kind of cling to you. So what I would recommend trying is, and obviously it's hard to, but like that kind of it's hard depending on Austin and Pflugerville and what stages and everyone's in, and comfortability, but trying to create like a structured social interaction. So like, you're there, I'm still here, but we're going to go do this with these other parents and kids in a way that's not uncomfortable for the other parents to be there as well. Because I know when they're 14, that there's a lot less parent involvement in hangouts, but in ways kind of trying to structure that so you're still there, but you have these times to interact with others. Almost like a park play date kind of a deal, but for older kids.
Yeah, like a hangout. Yeah, we can't say play date. Oh Lord, yeah, a hangout.
Right.
Can you
imagine?
Yeah, a chill time with someone.
Right, spoken like the parent of a teenager. Chill time. Yeah. Okay. And then what people are talking about too, and in the chat, about how, they don't, like, just by limiting access to TikTok, like they're still gonna have those feelings about their bodies or their social status or whatnot. Yeah, it's a really, oh, and Dana, you were the one that responded. Never mind, I see that. But yeah, making sure that you're having those real life social connections and interactions. Those are, like I said, the key, kind of like the antidote to it. Like, you're modeling for them, you're having these open conversations about bodies, about, our life compared to others' lives, and how important it is to be, gracious and thankful for what you have. Volunteering, pieces like that can really help.
Yeah, I was watching one of the reality shows that was based on, I guess, some famous people from TikTok. Came across it on Netflix and thought I'd sit there and watch it with my daughter this weekend. And you are absolutely right. I mean, they are created for the show. And I had to remind her, luckily they went behind the stage and they showed the makeup artist and the people checking out their clothes. I can't remember the name of this show, but it's like all of that is, it really is a movie. It's like a movie. TikTok is like movies. They put their clothes on because that's exactly what they want to wear. They use the cameras in sort of a different angle and all the lighting. So kind of talk to them about everything that's done before that. And then you can even find those before and after pictures, like this is the regular me every day. And then this is the me that I put on for TikTok. And if they see those, they're like, oh my gosh, they are just regular people like me when I wake up in the morning. So it's anything you can do to counteract those images.
Yeah, and teens are very, very visual. Like they are, you got to see it to believe it kind of brains, because then they get these thoughts in their heads that are completely irrational. And so helping, exactly like Dana was saying, like show them the actual visual, and then that's how they start to have that understanding. Because we as adults are completely experiential learners, and a lot of what frames our kind of ideas is from things that we've seen and experienced, and so they're gaining those experiences right now. So you are kind of curating that a little bit, just like their TikTok and Instagram accounts are curated. Anybody else have any questions? I know I covered a lot in a short amount of time. So.
You guys are all great. Okay, so I'm going to leave that chat open for a little bit. And so you can get actually, Kate, can you put your contact information up again? Just so that if you need to have a chance to write it down, there it is.
Yep. There we go.
Oh, we have a lot of people sending their things. I appreciate you guys for being here. We do have another presentation that I did previously. So if you send an email, I'll go ahead and share our YouTube page that has that one as well. A lot of what we're doing right now is around behavior, discipline, mental health. And so that's what I'm hearing you need. So I'll keep bringing those to you. I am grateful for you all to give us an hour of your time. I know it's during lunch, but it seems like this may be the best time to get a hold of you guys. So take that survey. Let me know if another time would be helpful. And we appreciate you. Thank you so much, Kate, for being here. God bless you all. Stay safe.
Bye.